let's move to another equally hot topic, in fact, the talk of the town, which is autonomous vehicles. And for that, I'm joined by a fully virtual panel. So for that, I'll sit in the middle so as to balance the symmetry out. Right, so we are joined by 3 speakers, all from the UK, I believe. And their names will be coming up shortly. We have Connor Champ, a lawyer at the Automated Reviews Vehicles Review from Law Commission. We have Andre Burgess from the Assured Autonomy Program at National Physical Laboratory NPL, and Richard at the Autonomous and Connected Vehicles Division of Innovate UK. And we are going to be talking about legislating and regulating fully autonomous driving. Welcome. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us early, your time. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Right,
good afternoon to you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Well, we're going to start with you,
good
Richard.
Afternoon, yes.
Good morning, everybody.
Okay.
Well, Richard, let's start with you. Now, we know that the UK has publicly announced their commitment that by 2025, they want to operationalize fully autonomous self-driving vehicles on the roads. And along with that, they've invested £100 million into safety research. Now, tell us more about the maturity of autonomous technology today, because as far as we know, most cars are still at level 2, level 3 autonomy. How far are we from the Nirvana day where we just have to pack our picnic baskets, lean back, and let our cars do all the work?
I think we're not quite at Nirvana day yet, but the important thing to realize is that for autonomous vehicles, there are 2 distinct strands. As you've mentioned, we've seen normal, regular cars, private vehicles have got advanced driver assistance systems which are edging towards autonomy, but they're not there yet. And to get fully robust systems is going to take some time. But on the other hand, we've also got a second stream, which is the vehicles which are intended to be fully autonomous. And typically, we're starting to see some early applications of those in commercial settings. So these vehicles have got fairly limited operational areas. And as you mentioned, the projects which we've announced last month, which the government has invested in, those projects are working in very specific areas. And we're choosing the easy areas first. Why make it difficult? So you choose the easier solutions first, and the ones which can be made economic first, and then gradually we will expand out and improve those technologies and make those vehicles more capable so that we can do more with them.
And which are those low-hanging fruits that you're mentioning here?
Well, the obvious ones. In fact, it's very similar to the hydrogen discussion we were having earlier. So things like point-to-point in depot applications, ones where you don't go onto roads which are unknown or poorly supported. One of the areas that we have got, of course, is when the autonomous vehicle hits a scenario which you can't cope with, and we try and avoid that by designing in as much capability as we can, as much capabilities cost effective with the technologies of the day. But fundamentally, there will always be those times when the vehicle can't cope. So what do we do then? Realistically, you could have an external remote operator, a remote driver, who can take over to cover those circumstances when there's a problem. But to do that, you've got to have a good connectivity. And good connectivity is a bit of a problem because it's not consistent. And if you've got a remote operated vehicle, again, it depends on how it's being done. Some vehicles, people are looking at using full remote control. So the guy in the office is literally doing the steering, doing the accelerator, doing the brake. To do that, you need to have video bandwidth, very high levels of video bandwidth, and you're going to have very low latencies between the remote operator and the vehicle. And that's really stressful on a communications infrastructure. And if something goes wrong for one autonomous vehicle, the chances are it's going to go wrong for all those in the area, so it's going to stress that particular cell even more. So that's a bit of a problem. So if you're rolling out an autonomous vehicle system which is requiring that level of remote operation, you've got to think very carefully about whether your communications in the whole area where it might operate, whether that's good enough. Some of the autonomous vehicles are a little bit more intelligent. So instead of having to actually do all the driving remotely, you could just say, actually, you've got a problem. The problem is that it's a hailstorm. So just wait where you are for a minute and it'll clear. Or um, there's a flock of sheep on the road. And if there's a flock of sheep on the road, okay, well, just edge for it very nice and slowly. So all these sorts of things, you can pitch in different ways, but they require different levels of connectivity. So the connectivity might be good in a city, but it might be very, very poor in rural areas. So that's going to tend to limit what we can do until the vehicles become more smart.
Absolutely. Could you expand a bit more? So again, what I'm hearing from you is that maybe you're experimenting with pushing the boundaries towards level 4 autonomy, but we're certainly very far off from level 5, where they can do all the driving in all conditions, right? And with all challenges. What are some of the lingering challenges? You mentioned connectivity is one of the must-haves. What are some other challenges that need to be overcome? And what is Innovate UK along with the rest of the autonomous industry doing to overcome those challenges?
Okay, those challenges depend on where you are. So, for example, in Singapore, you've actually got it pretty easy because you've got a relatively small, very modern road infrastructure, and everybody tends to obey the rules. I mean, that's a cultural thing. So autonomous vehicles in Singapore will probably come quite early because you've got nice conditions for it. But where you've got really problematic weather conditions or people who do silly things, pedestrians, drunk people who wander across the road, sheep across the road I've spoken about. These sorts of challenges are much more difficult. So we will get there. The autonomous vehicles will eventually be able to cope with these things. But to do that, we need to have better sensing systems and we need to have better compute systems. And we need to understand what the problems are. Fundamentally, we need to have a much better grasp of what all these difficult edge case challenges are. And that's going to come by experimentation and by the trials such as the ones that we're doing at the moment or that we've got planned to do in the next few years.
Right, like you said, it's all about overcoming those edge scenarios, predicting what humans and animals can do, the very silly things that we might do very unexpectedly. Right? And being able to overcome that on the roads live. Now, which brings me to Andre, actually. Now, Andre, you're from National Physical Laboratory, NPL. Right. And for those of us, you might not know, NPL is very well world-renowned for standards and measurements. In fact, it is where Alan Turing developed his first computing engine. Now, Andre, we know that current functional testing of human-driven vehicles are certainly not enough to assure fully autonomous self-driving ones. And that's why you and your colleagues are hard at work trying to create a national measurement framework. Can you tell us more about the advanced research you're doing around this? You know, and how are you setting up realistic simulation environments, taking into account everything Richard said earlier, sheep, humans, weather conditions, and beyond, sensor interference?
Yes, so first to reassure everyone, there's not that many sheep on the streets of London, but if you go further out, you'll definitely find a few around the countryside. So I think firstly, MPL, our work is very much collaborative. So we actually work with other organizations who are developing things like simulation environments or virtual test environments and who are developing sensors. And we help them with the measurement challenges, and measurements are very important, but just one component of this whole assurance process. We see measurement from our perspective really much about how you get confidence in the data. You have confidence in the data, you've got a very good starting point in terms of understanding whether your system is reliable or not, because you can build the test to achieve that. So I think that one of the main things that we're looking at right now is indeed around sensors. A key component of our focus has been with sensors, do we really understand how they're performing in different conditions? That's the first part of that. And do we understand actually what things impact and meaningfully impact the performance of sensors? And if that's understood, then can we start to build a picture of what types of conditions a vehicle with a suite of sensors or a system with a suite of sensors should be operating in? That's the first part of that challenge. And then how do we turn that into something which can support a regulatory or certification regime, but can also help the developers in the design of their system and the optimization of their system? And bear in mind, one of the things about this, as well as safety and reliability, the systems also have to be efficient and effective. So we don't want to create an environment where there's too many barriers in terms of testing or regulation. What we're trying to do is move towards sort of an optimal balance between the reliability and usability of any testing regime. One other thing that we also focus on through this work is using the data, I've been quite technical here, but the sort of physics models that we get from the measurement that we do to start building out more reliable sensor models in virtual test environments. So again, we work very closely with other organizations who are working in that area to understand where the gaps might be in current models. The reason why that's important, and I'm sure some of the audience understand that, is simulation, or particularly virtual testing, is a very useful component for replacing, or not just replacing, but enhancing physical testing. Physical testing has the challenge of being quite costly. It's quite difficult to test edge scenarios if those edge scenarios involve risk or potentially quite large budgetary implications by crashing things. So a virtual test environment can give you the advantage of doing things more safely, more cost effectively, and indeed you can even do things in a faster way as well, either by running multiple scenarios for tests or running scenarios at a faster rate. So the key there, though, is, do you trust your virtual test environment? And what we are doing and working with others on is coming up with the set of tools and the set of metrics which help you validate the reliability of that environment. I hope that's answered part of your question.
Yeah, that's great. You spoke about literally using virtual simulations to test the sensors, right? Put them through extreme weather, put them through sheep darting out or drunk people, or sensor interference, radar, LiDAR, not to mention different sensor manufacturers. Can you describe a specific test that you are working on, if that's already ready, a virtual simulation test?
I'm probably going to be a little bit careful because what we do is quite confidential in terms of the test we do, so I can't give anything away. At the moment, we have been working with an open source, I can talk about this, we've been working with an open source test environment, and what we've done is been looking at the sensor models that have been developed there, and then we've taken the actual data we've got in the field, and we work with the Met Office, who are the UK's meteorology agency, national agency for the government for the UK, and they take very accurate weather measurements. So we combine that information about the weather and the information about the impact of the weather on the sensor, and the measurements we take from a real environment, and we recreate that in this virtual environment. So you can actually see a recreation of our test environment. And then what we do is we compare how our models see that, say, for example, radar and LiDAR, which are especially more complex in this space, to emulate in a virtual test environment. And we see where the gaps are in the environment created by the open source technology. So that's an example of what we've been able to do. And from that, we've actually been able to improve those models already.
All right, thank you for sharing that. Speaking about the very complex mix, let me go to regulations and legislation first, and then I'll circle back to you, Richard and Andre again. So Connor, you are our legislation go-to guy here on this panel. And of course, we have been talking about, let's talk first about the fact that the UK is the first country in the world to introduce a legal framework surrounding fully autonomous vehicles. Could you share with us some of those legislations that have already been announced, for example, surrounding responsibility in the event of an accident, as well as legislations that are still being hotly debated by your office?
Sure. I mean, well, I'll start by first saying and pointing out that there are actually quite a few countries and jurisdictions that have put in place regulation and legislation around automated vehicles. For example, Germany has introduced regulation in the last 2 years, which relates to the deployment of automated vehicles, and California is obviously a prominent example of that as well, and Japan, for example. I think what's unique about the UK and what it's done is that about 5 years ago now, it decided to put in place very basic insurance provisions related to AVs. And then what the government did, which was quite unique globally, was it asked a law reform agency, that's the Law Commission, that's what I belong to, we're an independent arm's length body, to do a comprehensive review of the entire legal framework as it relates to AVs. And then on top of that, then make proposals for a new regulatory framework. So it was really quite unusual to get a law reform agency to review all of the law before the thing which it's reviewing is actually on the market, or for the most part is on the market. So try and preemptively look at all of the problems and then propose something new before you get widespread deployment. So as you might imagine, there's quite a lot to look at when you look at the entire legal framework in relation to AVs. What we did is we looked at everything holistically, and then we proposed a new framework which relates to things like the legal meaning of self-driving. So it's very important to understand what is or isn't part of your legal framework. Richard talked about advanced driver systems earlier. You want to make a distinction between very advanced driver assistance systems and AVs, and it's important to get that right from a legal standpoint. So we looked at that. We also looked at safety assurance before deployment, safety in use. So how do you make sure that vehicles continue to drive themselves safely on an ongoing basis? Criminal and civil liability, obviously, we looked at as well in all aspects of that, and then data. Off the back of that, we've made legislative proposals for the UK. It's hard to get across 4 years worth of proposals, but very briefly, if I go through the key ones to highlight, the first one I'd point out is the new authorization process. So what we've proposed is that there should be a new authorization process, so you can go and get your vehicle approved and authorized for use as self-driving in the UK. And the other unique aspect of that is that it accommodates both international approvals and domestic ones. So you can go and get your vehicle approved elsewhere, and then there's an assessment for authorization in the UK. So it doesn't matter if you're an international manufacturer who wants to bring something to the UK, that's fine. We've also proposed new legal actors and new roles in relation to AVs. A prominent one is what we call the automated driving system entity, and that's the entity or corporation or manufacturer who puts forward a vehicle for authorization. So they come to the regulator and say, please authorize my vehicle as self-driving. Another important actor is what we call a NUIC operator. Don't need to worry too much about that acronym, but basically that's an operator of, say, what you might term a level 4 or above vehicle. Say they want to run passenger services or so forth. That's a new legal actor that we've proposed. Also, very importantly, an in-use safety regulator. So we've proposed that. So that's a regulator that makes sure that vehicles stay safe on an ongoing basis and can do things like withdraw authorization if vehicles become unsafe. And then just whipping through them very, very quickly because I'm conscious of time. Criminal sanctions for interference with AVs, new criminal sanctions for organizations who lie about the safety of their vehicles to the regulator, marketing offenses for those which relate to how you sell automated vehicles. It's very important that people understand what is or isn't an automated vehicle. A new AV operator scheme for people who want to run passenger services and freight, and also new provisions about the storage of data and accident investigation. Now, just on top of that, I should say that these are all proposals, legislative proposals, which we've put forward. The government can implement them as they see fit, but currently their position, their official position is that they're going to implement all of these legislative proposals.
Certainly, it's a very robust and comprehensive relook, right? Or coming up with a new regulatory framework, like you said, everything from authorization to approval, right, to sales, and obviously to safety and to sanctions as well to keep them in line. But I wanted to highlight an issue that various ones of you have mentioned, which is that of data. There's going to be a lot of data generated, and especially in terms of in the event of an accident, right? Will the Law Commission, will the government be giving some guidance or legislations around the minimum level of data sharing that needs to go amongst the car OEMs, the insurance providers, the software providers as well? And what happens if that data crosses into proprietary territory? Maybe we'll start with Connor first, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
So it's important to note, again, that there's a lot of work being done at an international level on this. At the moment, there's not, at least from the UK perspective, there's not too much on the minimum data set that's required. There is, though, as I said, work happening at, say, a UN ECE level. The UN ECE level, the UN ECE is the organization that is responsible for a lot of technical regulations in relation to vehicles, and they are discussing what minimum data sets should be available from vehicles. Within the UK, also the British Standards Institute is currently working on this. They've published a paper, I think 2 years ago, what sort of metrics should be stored to enable the best possible investigations and attribution of liability and so forth. And also the UK Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation has produced another report on how important it is that you have this minimum data set that allows vehicles to explain actions. So it's very much a live issue and it's still being discussed, and people are debating what the minimum data set and how the data should be shared.
And it's
Under
very
our
much a black
proposed scheme.
box. Sorry, Connor, please continue.
That's right. So it is potentially a black box. What we've proposed under our scheme for Great Britain is that the minimum data set for all authorized AVs should consist of time and location data when a collision is detected, or when a transition demand occurs, or when there's a change from automated to manual driving. So, for example, if an AV is going from from where someone is driving it to its operational design domain and it becomes engaged, you have to store that minimum data set. This is just what we saw as the bare minimum required to accurately investigate claims and incidents involving AVs, and we talked with police officers, with accident investigators and so forth to determine that. I would highlight that an important aspect of this is the storage aspect as well, and that's something that's been debated, and something that we've proposed is that this data should be stored for at least 39 months. And that's because you have currently 3 years, and this is the same in a lot of European jurisdictions, you have up to 3 years to make a claim, and so you shouldn't be unfairly prejudiced if you're hit by an AV, so to speak. So it's important that that data is stored for at least 3 years, and we've added on 3 months as well, because at the moment it's unclear how long it might take to process that data. So that's the minimum data set. You brought up the issue of proprietary information and so forth. When you come and present your vehicle for authorization to the regulator, you are basically signing up to present that minimum data set. And I should point out that a lot of other jurisdictions are also coming up with similar minimum data sets. So Germany, for example, Germany is a big player in all of this. They've been quite prominent with some of the regulation that they've developed, and they've also said that you need to store this type of data. This is the minimum step that needs to be done.
Actually, Connor,
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to press in on this topic a bit more, because you said right now the basic level of minimum data is to provide time, location data, to provide a duration of how long they have to store that data for. But I've also heard of case studies where that is hardly enough to really investigate the cause of the crash. That might be to do with algorithms underpinning how the sensors are communicating with one another. And then add in another layer of complexity if there are sensors from different makers, right, in that vehicle. So actually on that note, I wanted to also ask Richard and Andre about your thoughts on this. How do we ensure that a vehicle is safe enough, we test it robustly, but not overstress them, right, with regulations, recommendations, and frameworks? How do we strike that very delicate dance? It's a big question.
That's an interesting...
I'll go.
Oh, both of you are speaking at the same time. Go. Richard first.
I'm sorry.
And Andre.
Should I go? Okay, thank you. It's very difficult to get the balance, and to be honest, we don't know what we need to do yet. It's still a bit of an unknown. But one area we have been looking at is what's called a digital commentary drive. And this is something that the British Standards Institute has been looking at. Going back to a human driver, in the UK we have something called the advanced driving test. And to do an advanced driving test, you have to basically give a continuous commentary about what's going on around you as a driver to the examiner who's sitting next to you. So you say, I can see that person's about to step out, so I'm going to slow down a little bit, or whatever it is they're going to do. And the idea is to come up with a similar sort of system where there is a standardized output where an automated vehicle will say digitally, this is what I've seen, this is what I've done about it. And if we can make an interface which is relatively standard, that we don't need to know how that vehicle came to that decision or how it sensed that person who was about to cross the road. All we need to know is that it did recognize that somebody was about to step out onto the road, or it didn't. So in that respect, we can start to work out what's gone wrong without getting into the proprietary information that's actually within how the vehicle works.
Absolutely. Andre, what about from a frameworks standards point of view?
I think we work across all different domains of land, sea and air. The challenges are very, very similar. And I think both Colin and Richard have spoken very eloquently to some of the innate challenges around assurance. I do think we don't want to get into the space where companies are feeling that their proprietary technologies and IP are being exposed to everyone. Otherwise, it kind of undermines the incentive to invest in the first place. However, there is a real challenge of evidencing truth here. So, I mean, even in Richard's example of the digital commentary, what are you comparing that to? Where is the ground truth of what really happened to say, well, actually, that system was seeing the right thing? I think what's interesting is some of the frameworks, or there's a general drive in terms of frameworks around what we call measuring the true capabilities and limitations of the system. So this comes back to things that you've probably heard about the operational design domain and looking at the behaviors of systems and being able to measure whether or not they are behaving appropriately considering the conditions and the situation they face. So that's looking at whether they comply with the rules of the road in this case. I think that's very important. I think once you start saying, let's investigate what the algorithm was doing, you have to have a sort of a baseline set of tools that can do that equally fairly across all systems. Then you have to say, how does a system which has been involved in the crash, how does the organization that owns or runs that evidence that it's fixed the problem? And that becomes hugely challenging if you're looking at it at the level of just the sensor or the algorithm fix. Are there sufficient amount of tests that can check that? So I think this is a learning process. I think one of the things I will say is there's a lot of autonomy out there. It's not on the general roads at the moment. There is an awful lot of autonomy out there. And the good thing is we're learning all the time. I think there's a lot of businesses that are learning very well and building incrementally. I think the real challenge is how do we evidence that they are safe and reliable, also the job they're designed for as well. And I think that's the real challenge we face at the moment.
Absolutely. I think really just making sure it's safe and reliable, good enough to go onto the roads, but yet not making it too hard for the companies to make it a reality. Now, I would like to open the floor for questions. I'm sure you have plenty of questions for our experts on the panel. The lady in red over here. And we have 2 questions from online as well, but let's hear from our audience here at MBS, and then we'll go to online questions.
Thank you for our panelists to throw the slide and share the learning from UK. I'm Tracy from Shell eMobility. I want to throw a different lens to talk about how we can bring the whole AV system to real. Based on what we learned, what do you think could be the different requirement of the charging infrastructure in the AV ecosystem versus the normal charging infrastructure requirements for the normal EV?
Okay, so the question is about the charging infrastructure for autonomous vehicles and
compared with
EV. So in terms of where we are today?
In terms of the different requirement of the charging infrastructure.
Okay, different requirements for AV charging infrastructure versus EV. Who would like to take this? Richard, let's go.
Okay, I think it depends on the type of automated vehicle. Where we have an automated vehicle which is operating from a known fixed point, whether it's a depot, or it's a personal car that's being driven by a family. In those sorts of circumstances, then I think you could still get away with the existing traditional plug it in at home, plug it into a wall box, or plug it into a charger which is at a depot, and we can rely on humans to do that. And then that's probably the best way to do it if you can, because the losses are minimum. Where the autonomous vehicle has got to go and find a charging point out in the wild, whether that's in the city or wherever, it's likely it will have to find some way of connecting to that charger autonomously. And I think that's really the nub of the question that's come through. And you can do that with induction systems. We don't have any induction systems which are freely available anywhere yet. People are working on them, they're developing such systems. But again, we have problems with standards, with interoperability of different types of systems. And the fundamental problem is that if you have a big gap between the charging loop that's in the ground and the charging that's on the vehicle, they are intrinsically inefficient. So you might only get 80% efficiency. It can get better than that if you're really close, but that makes it impractical in terms of actual use for a lot of vehicles. So there are significant energy losses if you go the inductive charging route in a practical sense. Whereas if you can manually plug in, then that's better. There is another alternative, and that is to use robot plug-in. So you literally have a robot arm which plugs the connector into the side of the vehicle. People have looked at these, and there have been some prototypes, but again, they're very expensive. Quite how reliable they will be in public service, who knows? We don't tend to have a lot of robots on the side of our roads because they're fairly aggressive and hostile places. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But for most circumstances, we can get away with manual plug-in because it's likely to be somebody in charge of the vehicle who can do that.
Right, thank you for that. So I think it really boils down to maybe more feasible to start with returning to a base station that point to point, as we mentioned earlier, and then also working on fixing compatibility issues so we make sure we don't lose any energy in the charging process. Well, other questions from our live audience here at MBS? Yes, please, the lady in front in green.
Hello, we are Autonomous A to Z from Korea with a Singapore office team. What will be the first 1 to 2 commercial deployments, use cases that you foresee that will have widespread deployments, and by when?
Is this about Singapore or in the world?
You can choose UK.
Probably so that Richard, you're probably best positioned to answer that one since you have very close contact with that side of things.
Okay, I didn't want to hog the microphone, as it were. We're certainly seeing the sort of local applications and local services being adopted at the moment. So we've got 5 passenger services which we've just announced, and they're running a mixture of different types of vehicles for public service, for public passenger services. One of them involves buses up in Scotland, so that's full-size single decker buses. We've got projects with various smaller vehicles in England and some mid-size shuttle buses in Northern Ireland coming up in Belfast. But these are all operating in a relatively confined environment, so a relatively small area and relatively defined location because of all the problems we talked about in terms of understanding what those odd challenges are and the connectivity issues and so on. So I think we're a bit of a way yet from having vehicles which are doing services over a widespread area, but I think in confined areas we're seeing them, or we'll certainly see them in the next 2 or 3 years.
Well, I hope that answers your question.
If I could just add to something.
UK context, but I think we have much to look forward to, especially commercially. Now, this is a question that maybe Andre and Connor, you can chime in on from online. What is the required latency for good enough safety? The required latency for good safety, however you define it.
Entirely contextual. That I'm afraid to say. I was just going to say, following on from Richard's point, but this links to this as well. This is very contextual. I think one of the things that we need to look at is the way we phrase things in terms of connect autonomous vehicles. We should almost be looking at the operational use case or the need, and then understand where autonomy fits in. So if you want to understand where the first real commercial deployments will take place, it's going to be driven by that. And then you start to look at things like aging population, pandemics, climate change, and those types of things will have an impact where autonomy will, at scale, be really useful and will have a real commercial driver to it. So that will also start to answer that question about latency in terms of relation to safety. In an ideal world, everything responds immediately, but that's not necessary. I'm going to move slightly away from vehicles because we also work in maritime, and clearly out in the open ocean, latency is sometimes less of an issue because there's not many things to bump into. But again, that's contextual. So if you are moving in a fairly controlled environment at a very, very small number of miles or kilometers an hour, latency is potentially less of an issue in how you respond to things. I think the other question about latency, though, that is very important to understand is your reliance on connectivity. We are talking about autonomous or automated and connected. And that often, I think the connected bit often gets slightly overlooked. Everyone gets very fascinated by the decision-making or the autonomous part. But the connectivity is very important. It's not necessarily just about sending commands. It is about that information flow. And even the information flow within a vehicle, there's still connectivity there. So that type of latency is something that does need to be understood and is actually part of the authorization of a system.
That's a good point. So I'm hearing that latency is dependent, is contextual. The kinds of latency thresholds required for, say, something in a maritime setting for a vessel versus an AV on the road in an urban setting, that's quite different. And of course, even if the sensors have low latency, fast response, it very much also depends on the larger connectivity infrastructure. Great point, Andre. I wanted to we have time maybe for one more question from the live audience, if there's any. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Just making sure I don't miss any hands. If not, Connor, are there any on this front of perhaps on latency guidelines, are there any along those veins from a legislative, regulatory point of view?
Oh, well, interestingly enough, we've just undertaken a review of remote driving off the back of the automated vehicles review. And we published that advice to government about 2 weeks ago, actually. And obviously latency and connectivity is a major component of remote driving. That's where you have a driver in a remote operation center or something. It's a live issue. We consulted on it. And just to back up what Andre and Andre's already said, there's no consensus on what the acceptable latency is for a particular, there's no set absolute level that people agree on. It does seem to be use case dependent. Very much will vary depending on what people are intending to do with it. I think from a regulatory perspective, what we've proposed is that whoever is doing these types of operations, and that'll be people who are doing remote driving operations, but also those potentially doing AV ones as well, because they'll be mixed in a lot of use cases. People who do AVs will also sometimes do remote driving. What we've said is that the operator needs to come to the regulator and make a safety case for why their particular latency, their particular use case is safe. And they also have to make efforts to guarantee connectivity and provide assurance that connectivity, latency, jitter will all be reliable enough to do what they say that they can do.
So it's absolutely great to hear that you're all taking into context what the commercial industry wants, what they define as good enough latency, while balancing that against what is safe enough for users and pedestrians on the road. Now, we're very much looking forward. I hope that by year 2025, just about 2+ years from now, we will indeed go to London or rural UK and see fully self-driving vehicles, drunk people and sheep notwithstanding. So with that, thank you so much. Thank you, Richard, Andre, Connor. This has been a most interesting discussion. Thank you for taking time to share your thoughts with us today. Thank you once again. Thank you. Yes, join us in thanking our panel.